Okay, Toby Fox, I know we've had our moments, we've had our fun times and our falling outs and whatnot, but a lot of the hype for Undertale has comparatively died down since its release, and people were surprisingly receptive to my thoughts on that game, all things considered. So, what's going on here then? What's your next big project that I'm going to have to play devil's advocate for? I'm in! Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and in this video I'm going to be talking a fair bit about Deltarune, because that's totally the topical thing to do right now. Well, in my defense, this video has already been online for a month. For the lovely people who support me on Patreon, more information in the description and at the end of the video, so it's not as if I'm completely mistiming this video. That being said though, this video, much like the one I did about Undertale last year, will take the assumption that you've either already played the game or that you don't especially care about spoilers, so spoiler warning. However, I'm not going to be delving into the lore or the theories, unlike most people who are doing, or by now have done, videos about this game. Rather, I'm going to look at it as an overall standalone experience, informed more than a little bit by having played Undertale before it. So, in order to do that, as ever, we should begin with the fast facts with this game. And with this game, those facts are very fast indeed. Just like Undertale before it, Deltarune was developed pretty much completely by Toby Fox, with very little outside help, though that might change in the future, we'll see. After all, what we're talking about is technically quote-unquote just a demo of sorts, so it may yet be subject to change. Even if it's not, it's just a PC-bound, self-proclaimed Chapter 1, and Toby himself has stated that it might take up to 999 years to create the rest of the game, and to do that, he may or may not have to assemble a dedicated team. Still, what we have for the moment was made just by him, and it was released online on the day of Halloween 2018 in the form of a download from a totally not suspect-looking website, presenting itself as something of a survey program, alongside a series of cryptic tweets that vaguely suggested that this experience might provide some answers about the mysterious entity from Undertale known only as W.D. Gaster. Spoiler alert, it did no such thing. That's not to undersell what we got instead, though. While most were expecting a 10-minute or so survey-esque experience, what the game actually presents is a brief character customization screen that, in true Toby Fox fashion, insults your choices and spits on everything you just did, and then throws you into a completely new game, in what looks like a very familiar world, albeit one that raises a lot of questions, and very rapidly at that. At first, it seems like a sequel to Undertale, taking place on the surface world after the events of the previous game, with the monster races of said previous game now free to live where they want, as we immediately see some characters we recognise in new, more normal, more real-world roles, like a police officer or a school teacher. But some parts of it just don't add up with the lore we already know. But before we get a chance to properly question any of it, we're partnered up with the bully of our protagonist's school class and thrown into the so-called dark world located inside the school's supply cupboard. So, standard fare so far. And so begins this rather Alice Through the Looking Glass-esque adventure. We play as a human named Chris, accompanied on and off by class bully and general brute Susie, and almost immediately we're also joined by the adorable self-proclaimed Dark Prince Ralsei, who proceeds to spend the entire game being precious and adorable and snuggable and just generally the best boy in all of time and space, and on this matter I will not budge. In this post-prologue opening sequence, we also meet Lancer, who sort of counts as an antagonist, I suppose? He's sort of like a quirky fusion of Sans and Papyrus from the previous game, at least in terms of character, though that's not to say he has no originality to him whatsoever. He's more than a bit hapless, but still plenty of fun, and he, as well as our trio of fair-weather heroes, get plenty of character development and screen time over the 4 hours or so you'll spend with them, but I'll come back to that point in a bit. From the writing, you know this game is in the same family as Undertale. From the characters, you know this game is from the same family as Undertale. Even the gameplay, from wandering an overworld to getting into random encounters in which attacks are conveyed as bullet hell minigames, are more than reminiscent of Undertale. What also shines though, and that might not be as obvious to appreciate right out of the gate, is this game's overall aesthetic. And I'm not talking about the fact that the game draws heavy inspiration from the symbology of a deck of cards, because Lord knows you can't talk about this game's symbolism without someone piping up with, "Homestuck did the card things first! Toby Fox worked on that too!" Like, yeah, I know, I get it, but I'm not talking about Homestuck, I'm talking about Deltarune, and as I said earlier, Lewis Carroll beat both franchises to the punch by over 150 years anyway. Why do Toby Fox's works keep attracting that kind of people? Incidentally, don't get me wrong, the idea that the whole game derives from various toys and games is a cool idea, whether it's been done before or not. There's the obvious thing of the various characters being aligned to one card suit or another, and that in turn determines what sort of attacks they can use in battle, and then the slightly more subtle thing of a drafts piece getting to the end of the so-called Great Board only to be kinged on the spot and turned into a boss, and also the fan-favourite thing of characters Shawm and Jevil representing the red and black jokers. These are all cool ideas, executed well. Honestly though, I just wanted to praise how this game looks on a visual level and sounds on an aural level, I guess? Like, forget the metaphors and the theories and the symbols for a hot minute and just look at the game. Just listen to the game. Undertale derived pleasure from pretending to be limited to 8-bit for as long as possible, only to pull the rug out from under you when it'd have the most impact. Conversely, Deltarune seems to be over that in a progression that feels surprisingly natural. I know this is a really subtle, really inconsequential detail to pick up on, but one thing that really stood out to me was the colour of the text. Like, bear with me, I know it might seem like a dull talking point, but I find it to be a good metaphor for the game's overall visual presentation. In Undertale, text colour was of vital importance, because battle opponents that could be spared would have their names presented in yellow, or pale pink if you pestered that one frog guy enough at the beginning. That's true of this game as well, but instead of it being a solid yellow colour, there's more of a gradient to it. This also applies to any other coloured formatting applied to in-game text, which again is very important to the overall mechanics of the game. Now, imagine that sort of upgrade principle applied to Undertale as a whole, and you've got Deltarune. I mean, just look at this game's use of colour. I'll throw up both hands and say that I hate the idea of colour theory as an academic subject, even though, yes, it makes perfect sense, but that doesn't mean that I can't still say this game looks pretty. You know, for a place supposedly called the Dark World, it's surprisingly vibrant and colourful, and there are some theories about why that is, and we're absolutely not here to discuss them today. This principle applies to the music as well. Though there's obvious harkening back to Deltarune's roots, both in terms of relating back to Undertale, and in terms of both games' inspirations, Deltarune doesn't even bother pretending to be limited to an 8-bit sound font. I mean, the first big piece of music in the game, when you enter quote-unquote the game itself, i.e. when you're done with all the prologue stuff, even declares its presence on screen for all and sundry to see, and to be honest, Field of Hopes and Dreams is an absolute bop that suits the area's visuals down to the ground, or the underground as the case may be, and that's saying nothing of the popularity of the game's battle theme. All of this is to say, the overall presentation of Deltarune is very nice. Granted, it seems like a mundane thing to praise the game on, considering, well, everything else about it, but consider this. This game could have so easily just been Undertale but with a different story. But no, Toby Fox consciously chose to take the experience of developing Undertale, learn from that, and then apply that knowledge to the development of Deltarune. Make no mistake, both games have been in development for a much longer time than we the public originally knew about, but that doesn't really discredit my point in any way. He could have cut the graphics from Deltarune from exactly the same cloth as the graphics for Undertale, but no, he chose to improve on them. Same goes for the audio, and that's an excellent mentality for a game developer to be in when creating a follow-up to a game, especially a successful one, whether it's canonically a sequel or whatever. And let's not forget, after the somewhat inflated impact Undertale had on the internet, Deltarune had big boots to fill, and Toby Fox was very much aware of this, so it's good that he stepped up with the game's presentation. But a game like this can't just rely on aesthetics alone, and after the popularity of the first game's cast, again, the bar was set pretty high, but Deltarune rises to the occasion easily. Considering that we see a few familiar faces in the opening part of the game, and considering that this was allegedly going to tie in with Gasta's backstory somehow, it could have been so easy for the game to rely on utilising Undertale characters and having their pre-existing popularity keep the game afloat, irrespective of the quality of writing. But no. As soon as we get into the main meat and potatoes of this game, we're introduced to an entirely new cast, which has a rather profound effect of setting a certain tone, really. The game waves familiarity in our faces, and then says, forget about them, they're background characters at best, don't even think about them. And then thrusts a load of new faces our way instead. And that, make no mistake, is quite the power move. First things first, we have our player character, and this time their name isn't a plot point whatsoever. Literally the first concrete thing we learn about this game's world at all is that we are following a human named Chris. And, much like the human from Undertale, they are non-binary and thus use they pronouns throughout. Not that Chris actually talks out loud at any point, but still. The first ally that we meet is Susie, the aggressive school bully from Chris's class. She doesn't seem the sort who'd willingly travel around with Chris, much less willingly participate in a game where ending combat encounters peacefully is the prime objective, and you're right, she doesn't. More on that later, but basically she more or less represents the mindset of, why the hell would I flirt with my enemies? Swing your axe first and ask questions later, am I right? At this point, it's worth stepping in to point out that Chris and Susie are referred to in this particular game's lore as lighteners, that is, people who aren't from the Dark World. This is, in itself, noteworthy because, using Undertale's classification system, Chris is a human while Susie is a monster. In fact, Chris is the only human in the entire game as far as we've seen. So, while Undertale would consider them to be two highly different entities from basically two different species, countries, whatever you want to call it, Deltarune adds an extra layer to the taxonomy, is that the right word? That makes them, in the game's eyes, as good as the same in whatever regard. And that brings us onto the people of the Dark World. The Darkness. Okay, I can't wait any longer. If Chris is the embodiment of a new, fresh-faced player, and Susie represents someone who had no patience for Undertale's antics, then Ralsei, Prince of Darkness, represents someone who invested themselves 110% in the previous game's karma system. This adorable pile of fluff constantly advocates for peace and pacifism to such an extent that he brings an entirely new way of peacefully ending battles to the table. And he's a precious cinnamon roll who deserves all of the hugs because he's too pure and too perfect for this world. Oh, and there's also Lancer. He's the son of the only one of the 4 card kings who still holds any power after this unknown entity referred to only as the Knight upsets the balance of the Dark World or whatever. Despite his father being a completely irredeemable version of all the bad things Asgore stood for without wanting to in the previous game, Lancer is this cute, goofy Saturday morning cartoon villain at best. But that's not to say he's a shallow character by any means. He's a self-parody without realizing it. And bizarrely, that actually works surprisingly well for him. As I said before, despite the game's length being, as it is, a demo of a first chapter of a bigger story, we spend plenty of time with these characters getting to know them, what makes them tick, what gets to them, what drives them, and so on. We get to see all of them develop through legitimate, honest-to-goodness, well-written character arcs. We see them shift back and forth between being prophesized heroes and self-proclaimed bad guys as they all try to attune themselves to their own developing moral compasses. And given the circumstances, it's all written surprisingly believably. Sure, this does come across in the form of a series of rather predictable plot twists, especially around the halfway mark, but as diegetic character moments with the people we've come to know, I can't complain about their authenticity. When all's said and done, we care about Chris's future, we care about Ralsei's world, we care about Susie's more complex problems, we care about Lancer's fate. In that regard, yeah, Toby Fox has won at character design and writing. So, to recap, the visuals are like Undertale, but better. The music is like Undertale, but better. And the characters are like Undertale, but different. I'd say better, if only because I didn't get tired of them as quickly personally, but then again, Deltarune hasn't been out for as long, so who knows? Anyway, what about the sum of its parts? if we put all of those things together, is the gameplay like Undertale but better? Short answer, yes. Yes, it is. In my experience, Deltarune took the concepts that Undertale laid on the table and expands on most of them. Admittedly, the coloured attacks, like the green ones that restored health, or the blue ones that only did damage if you're moving when they touch you, they're gone. But that aside, everything else is back, bigger and better than ever. For one, okay, the battle system is a little bit more complicated and actually necessitates a proper tutorial this time around, but good grief if it isn't worth it. Now, unlike in Undertale, you have 3 options, apart from fleeing the battle. Pummel your opponent into the ground by fighting with a capital F, acting with a capital A until you can spare them with a capital S, because Toby Fox does love his meaningful words like that, like in Undertale, or tire them out and have Ralsei use his pacify spell to put them to sleep. Granted, this isn't utilised to its fullest potential, but it's some excellent groundwork going forwards. There's something about how every battle now uses 2 or 3 party members that makes the game feel more alive in a way. Sure, Undertale had the intimacy and heavy personal implications of taking on every encounter alone, but what Deltarune sacrifices there, it gains in the potential for strategy, character development, and, well, fun. Admittedly, if you actually want to pursue a pacifist playthrough, there are quite a few battles where you'll need to waste your first turn warning the opposition about Susie, so that all of her attacks, which she launches automatically whether you want her to or not, will miss, and that's a bit of a hassle, and similarly, Chris is the only one who can actually flirt with the enemies to make them be spareable. So 2 attack turns out of every 3 will be spent telling Susie and Ralsei to just defend while you do whatever it is you need to do to solve the encounter, but again, it's a classically Toby Fox way of toying with the medium for the purposes of conveying something, and in both of these instances, it works. Defending against oncoming attacks works just like in Undertale. Your entire being is condensed into a heart-shaped icon representing your soul, which is free to move in 2D space, and you just have to avoid oncoming bullets Toho style. Even with Ralsei and Susie in your party, you still just use the one heart. It's just that before the attack begins, you're told who's being targeted, so if a bullet hits that heart, that's who's going to suffer damage for it. Conversely, if you just narrowly miss being hit by a bullet, you gain all new TP, or tension points, which is what lets Ralsei cast spells, and then, if you don't use all of it by the end of the battle, any excess turns into bonus prize money. So there's a lot to keep in mind at all times, but it pays off rather nicely. One thing that expands on this concept that I really, really like is the idea of environmental hazards. That is, in Undertale, if you came across something in the overworld that would hurt you, like a security laser for instance, it'd have to take you into a mini battle screen and then hurl some bullets at you. Not so in Deltarune. Instead, the whole screen darkens, Chris's soul becomes visible, and the entire game screen becomes like the bullet box in battles. You dodge hazards in the overworld in a scaled-up parallel to how it works in battle, and that's actually really cool. Plus, having this system in place allows there to be more moments like this without it feeling too cumbersome, unlike with Undertale. This actually extends to the battles themselves too. Whereas in Undertale, you'd get into battles seemingly at random just for walking funnily, with Deltarune, you can see exactly where the potential upcoming fights are in the overworld, and are initiated by running into opponents, rather than the game just deciding, oh, it's time to fight now. Granted, some of them are unavoidable in the space you're given, and that's the idea, but still, it's just nice to see these things coming this time around. The one point in the gameplay that most people have picked up on, though, is the starkest difference between this and Undertale. While Undertale always played up the importance of sparing versus killing opponents in battle to the extent that what you do can lead to 3 different main endings, with a load of other changes splintering off from those depending on who lives and who dies, Deltarune instead tells you upfront to your face, repeatedly and from the beginning, that your choices do not matter. And it's telling the truth. Aside from exactly how the ending plays out, a difference amounting to little more than whether or not the other Darkners in the world rush to your aid during the final showdown with Lance's father, and you win the day either way regardless, your exact choices in the game, including the official name of your team of heroes, how many opponents you spare or fight, and whether or not you pursue the bonus boss, all have 0 impact on the story whatsoever. It starts the same way, it proceeds the same way, and it ends the same way. And I, for one, kind of prefer it that way, to be honest. As I said in my retrospective of Undertale last year, I felt too much like that game used your own choices as a stick to beat you with, and deliberately humiliate you for not magically knowing from the outset that the game wasn't the retro throwback RPG it pretended to be in all of its branding. With Deltarune, the game doesn't get that luxury. You get the same story no matter what you do. And that makes it feel much less preachy and frankly bullyish. It's not getting a rise out of tearing you down, it's just telling a story. Granted, some people preferred that, and there is a time and a place for it. It is still a cleverly done thing, I'm not detracting from that, but no, I prefer how Deltarune handles itself in that regard, but that's just me. So, with all of those things laid on the table, albeit incessantly in comparison to Undertale throughout, though that was never going to be avoidable to begin with, it's time I came up with a grade to assign to this curious little entity. Despite all comparisons I've drawn thus far, this grade is going to be based on Deltarune as a standalone experience, rather than judging its qualities in Undertale's shadow. And on top of that, this grade is given on the understanding that what we have currently is a demo of a first chapter, so if we do get a full and complete Deltarune sometime in the future, this grade won't be anywhere near as relevant to that as it is to this. So, with all of that in mind, I'm going to follow suit, as it were. Pun intended. Deltarune has a lot of things in common with Undertale, but just remixed and improved, including the name. And I'll extend that to its grade as well. Undertale was a low B, high C as I recall, so Deltarune gets a high B, low A. My reasoning here is that it is an absolutely fun little romp through a colourful, well-written world with delightful and memorable characters and a genuinely enjoyable take on story-driven RPG gameplay. The only thing that stays my hand as far as giving it the top rank goes is, funnily enough, the same thing that made me hesitate with Even the Ocean, and I love that game with all my heart and soul. This game does to Undertale sort of what it should do to itself in some areas. Sure, it expanded on the old battle format amongst other things, but there are some more ideas that really could be explored further. Ralsei's arsenal of magic for one, and how relatively infrequently his pacify spell is actually of use for another, bearing in mind how easily basically any opponent can be spared instead. It leaves more than a few possibilities to be desired, but then again, it's just a demo, so maybe that was to be expected. Obviously, if we ever see Deltarune as a full, complete game, that's probably going to be addressed, but I can't give this game a higher grade, because this game as it currently is what I'm reviewing, and this game as it currently is doesn't do that. It only holds the promise of maybe having the potential to maybe do that later if Toby Fox comes back to finish what he started, in a format that may or may not even exist ever. You feel? So, with that being said, and with the core Undertale fandom being summarily, grossly offended by my words yet again, it just falls to me to sign out of this video, as I always do, with an outward shout of thanks to the lovely people on patreon.com/TessHex, who supported this video to life as always. You've probably heard me say this many times before, so I'll keep it brief. All it takes is $1 per video in support of me, and you get to see these reviews and whatever a whole month before anyone else, ad-free, as well as a bunch of other perks, including access to an exclusive corner of my Discord server. Take a look if the fancy takes you. No pressure. In the meantime, I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and if I've not offended you so hard that your entire face has turned inside out from pure loathing, then I'll see you in whichever video of mine tickles your fancy enough to watch it next. See you there and then.